Today we're going to talk about a couple of concepts in that are very relevant to recovery and very much relevant to the world around us. In today's media, these topics are discussed vehemently by all sides. I'm going to talk about them because, you know what, all of it has made a difference in my recovery and in my perspective on recovery in general, right? So all of these things have impacted me in one way or another. Also in terms of the cognitive behavioral therapy and behavior modification therapy, which we will be talking about after harm reduction. In terms of those things, recovery isn't necessarily linear, right? Now, what leads us to believe that it might be linear is if we adopt a one perspective over all other perspectives, right? So an example of this as we lead into harm reduction is abstinence versus reducing the harm, right? So before we get into it, I want to talk about the two main concepts of harm reduction, okay? The first one is harm. What does harm mean, okay? So harm means, I just took this off the internet, one of the definitions. I'm sure you could find different ones. Physical injury, we know that physical injury can also mean emotional, intellectual, spiritual injury, or sexual injury, okay? Some kind of injury, especially that which is done deliberately. Now, I want to just put a point on this. I'm not blaming anyone for anything, obviously. We're all in this together. The idea that there's more than one concept should alarm people to the fact that maybe not one concept is correct. Maybe all the concepts are correct together if you put them together. So I am not an all or nothing. I am an and or person. So if it's and because it will help my recovery in some way, I want to add it, right? So anyway, we're not adding necessarily anything here by this discussion of harm reduction. What I'm trying to get at with harm reduction is the next things we're going to discuss are going to tie into harm reduction dramatically, right? So if we come from a perspective of abstinence only, I believe in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases when we preach abstinence only to people, we are causing harm. Okay, I'm not suggesting we're doing it out of deliberately. And I will tell you the honest truth is in the beginning of my recovery, harm reduction was not existent. Okay, and it wasn't existing as an option for me because partly because I came into a place that talked about abstinence only. Okay, so I came in there and I was ready to hear that message of abstinence only. And so it worked for me. Okay, I didn't drink, I didn't do morphine. Okay, that was basically the behavior modification that my brain put into play immediately upon walking into a 12-step group, right? I had no control over that. I had no control over whether or not I would go into that meeting and leave and drink. I had no control because I had no idea what I was in for. I had no clue what I was trying to actually do, okay? Now, in my case, abstinence from booze was the only thing that kept me away from the other stuff. Okay, so that was essential for me. Hence, I ended up at a 12-step group and I never picked up again after leaving that day. Okay, but that's my story. That's not necessarily the general story of everyone's experience. As time goes on in an abstinence-based program, what has changed my tune from abstinence only into harm reduction before we get into that, let's look at reduce. What does reduce mean? It means make it smaller, a less likelihood of causing permanent harm. We have to understand harm is really avoidance of death. That's what we're trying to do here. Why would we do that? Why would we want to prolong someone's journey? Well, first of all, it's not up to us to prolong or shorten anyone's anything, right? We've got to get out of that mindset that we can control this, right? That we can control this existence of what science now calls a brain disease, or some science call it a brain disease, okay, which is addiction. So what we're looking at with harm reduction is we're trying to reduce the likelihood of death, okay? We want to reduce the likelihood, and I spelled that wrong, of death, okay? That is the main goal of harm reduction. So of course, harm reduction, now some people today think that harm reduction is new, okay? That it's a brand new concept, but it's not. The first real instances of harm reduction came in the 80s with the AIDS crisis, okay? So remember in the 80s when it came, you might not have been there, so you might not be able to remember, but those of us who were there, we can remember. It came during the AIDS crisis because it was helping people who we blamed that it was a homosexual disease or a bisexual male disease, right? So that's what was coming out of the media, the wonderful media. But at the same time, people in a position to reduce the harm, to reduce the death of the people who were contracting AIDS, the virus or HIV, that was the idea. So what they started to do was they started to do free needle exchange, right? Because if you were HIV positive and you had AIDS, it was basically a death sentence back then, right? But it was also it made an opportunity for nice, kind, compassionate humans to start pointing the finger in a direction of morality, right? So what it came out as, it was more of a moral illness. And that's how people treated individuals, well, not everyone, of course, but that's how lots of people treated individuals with AIDS and HIV, 80s, 90s, and probably even to this day, depending on who you ask, okay? So that's when harm reduction first came in. And it was literal, okay, literally in to reduce the amount of deaths as a result of contracting the illness. So it's no different for addiction. The only difference that we can see from addiction is in our perspective of the addict, okay, and the process of addiction. That's where we're coming from. You have all kinds of wonderful groups that are abstinence-based for all kinds of good reasons. I appreciate those groups much like I appreciate the harm reduction groups that are actively trying to minimize the amount of death that we experience from addiction or alcoholism. Okay, so it's a harm reduction method. Now, I want you to understand some of the results of today's opioid crisis are directly related to abstinence-based programs. 100% directly related. Not all of them, not everything. There's correlation, not necessarily causation. That's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is there's a correlation. And this is what changed my mind, okay? Getting back to that. What changed my mind about harm reduction versus abstinence was, first of all, it's arrogant of me to think that because I needed abstinence, everybody needs abstinence. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's where my brain went right away. Was that I was a victim of that human thing. It works for me, it'll work for you, right? And that is something we do all the time, even to this day, right? I don't know what's going to work for you. This is why we're going to go through different concepts. Hopefully, you'll be able to find something that maybe unlocks the door to whatever it is you're hoping for, right? So the idea between harm reduction started to shift for me when I started to realize that really good people were dying. They were dying. Really good people who could not get the abstinence program. Now I say that because that's where I was coming from back then. I was coming from a position of abstinence only, and so it probably, I'm sure it came out in the way I taught, in the way I interacted with clients. All those kinds of things are true because that's the filter I was coming through with, right? Because a part of me latched onto the dogma, right? And I'm just calling it what it is. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just dogma, right? The dogma of the 12 steps, abstinence principles, because I needed them, right? But what happened when I started to see my good friends die? I'll tell you what happened. I started to look at this more seriously because I realized there was a correlation, again, I'm not suggesting causation, there was a correlation in their lives to potentially utilizing harm reduction methods to stay alive long enough to maybe get the abstinence hook, maybe, or long enough to figure out a way to use responsibly or drink responsibly, because people can do that. Just because I couldn't do it doesn't mean others can't. So I have to make sure I stay there, right? In that position of, I am not everyone. What works for me won't work for everyone. I happen to believe in some idea of a God. If you don't, what good would it do for me to beat you into submission and try to get you to believe in something that maybe you're incapable of believing? One of the things that I just mentioned there, incapable. When I say the word incapable, I don't mean necessarily morally not willing, okay? What I'm getting at is incapable, whether consciously incapable or unconsciously incapable. We are all not capable of the same things at the same time, right? Really, recovery is not linear. So we have to understand, sometimes we're going to need more things, other times we'll need less, right? But the whole idea of looking at this is so that you can examine what are your thoughts on harm reduction, right? And where do you get your thoughts on harm reduction? I know where mine come from, right? My thoughts on harm reduction come straight, as I told you, from watching my friends die and other people that I know die. Even though I knew they were giving abstinence 100% of their attention, their focus, they were trying, right? But yet they couldn't do it. And it wasn't just once or twice, it's repetitively unable. For one reason or another, I'm not suggesting it was conscious, unable to grasp whatever it was that maybe I could grasp right away about this concept, right? I think even when I came in, and even though I really didn't have a real head for it or love for it, the idea that there was a God was pretty stable in my subconscious, right? No idea what God looked like. I mean, the God that I came in with was awful, like a shitty God. That God was the one who basically pushed me, in my mind, right? Obviously, I am absolutely simplifying things. But anyway, I had that luxury, and I think it was a luxury, because I walked into a room that accepted that, right? That accepted that, even a faint belief, right? But I've seen people in the rooms, and eventually they leave, right? And I have some friends who've been through this. They leave the 12 steps and they go to more cognitive-based stuff, right? Like smart recovery, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. And we're going to talk about that. But first, before I want to talk about it, I just want to point out, okay, that people are going to do what they're going to do, no matter what we say. So telling someone they have to be abstinent to get better is not true. And I don't, to get better and to be a good human is what I'm saying. Obviously, if you take out all the chemicals that we put in our bodies, we're probably going to feel better, especially if it's coffee or something addictive like that. So we're going to feel better, but it might not last, right? So we want to try to be open, because the one thing that I don't want to do is send somebody packing just because they are having trouble not or stopping, right? Instead, I want to welcome those people just like anyone else and say, how can we address your needs? What are your needs? So that's the one of the things that abstinence also does, is it paints the picture that we can all be helped in the same way, right? And that's not true, okay? As for reasons I just mentioned, in terms of belief versus non-belief, in terms of faith versus no faith, right? And faith in a religious sense, not in the sense that a scientist has faith that, yes, if I turn the switch on, the light will turn on, right? Because it's got power and everything else that goes into it. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. It's not just religious faith. It's this faith that everything's going to be the way it's got to be. My job is to accept what that is, right? So before I move off of the harm reduction subject, I'm just going to let you know a couple of stats. So in 2018 in Alberta, okay, we lost 746 people to an overdose, to opiate overdoses. Okay, I'm going to say the number again, 746. Okay, that's a lot of people. That's 2 a day in Alberta in 1 year. Okay, that to me that's a crisis, right? So anyway, looking at those numbers, we have to understand there's got to be a different way to go at this. Abstinence has been the cornerstone of most programs, right? That either they deal with one thing or another, but abstinence is usually the goal, right? Like, I've yet to hear of a treatment center that's harm reduction based, like a legit treatment center, as opposed to a safe consumption site, which are vital as well, right? I'm going to refer you to look back at Vancouver's first, I think it was 99 or something like that. I could be way off on the date, but look at their approach to harm reduction. I think I can't remember the name of the place where it started, but look it up. Vancouver harm reduction. It's basically Canadians' origin of harm reduction. And so it's no wonder that wonderful doctors like Gabor Mate come out of that city, right? Because they have been examining this means for a long time, right? So that's one number, right? And the other number in the US, so this is going to be a huge number because it's US statistics, okay? In 2016, 64,000 people died of overdoses in the United States. 64,000. Not 6,400, that's 64,000 in 1 year span, right? Now, is it because of abstinence? I assure you it probably isn't because of it. But are there correlations? Yes. What happens to a person when they can't get something over and over and over again? Especially a person maybe like myself who's prone to self-destruction. Okay? So every failure is another piece of shame. Every failure, every inability to live up to those standards, to do things immediately, drastically different, you know, it's really hard, right? Because when I look back, I see all the harm reduction I was doing in early recovery, right? So I can tell you some of the things I was doing in the first few years of my recovery, not few months, first few years. So a harm reduction for me to stay away from booze and morphine was sex. Matter of fact, I even got more honest as I was in program when it came to sex, okay? Obviously, that is not sustainable. It's not a sustainable alteration forever, right? That's what sustainable means. So I used sex, I used work, I was always working. No matter what my job was, I was always there and dedicated, right? But I knew then, like I know now, I was avoiding. Back then I didn't care. I needed to avoid in order to not drink and not use morphine. So it was very simple, right? I know, and I tell you that I was attached to the dogma because at the time, some of these things were in the background. They weren't important then, right? Because what was important then was immediate. Booze, morphine. Pretty simple, right? But I used work, I used the gym. I was not a bodybuilder. I was in no way, shape, or form competing for anything or training for anything, but I was in the gym 7 days a week. Almost for like the first 2 or 3 years of my sobriety. 7 days a week, right? So it's no mystery why my back is all jacked up and my knees are buggered and my elbows hurt when I bench press. And like the list goes on, right? Because I was reducing harm, but because I was choosing things that if you go too far with them, you start to do harm, right? So I wasn't aware that what I was trying to do was reduce my harm. Had I been aware, maybe I would have taken it a little bit easier on myself down here. I'm not saying one way or the other. I've always been hard on myself, so I probably would have been. But I might have been aware that, oh my God, the reason I feel ashamed every time I have sex is because I'm using it, okay? I'm not experiencing it, I'm using it. Okay, and then that then leads people becoming a drug, sex, relationships, all kinds of problematic stuff comes out of there. What happens now if I had, instead of done these things, we're going to pick something simple, it's very relevant today, okay? We're going to use weed, okay? So, I know right now there's lots of people out there probably going, and by lots of people I mean the 6 of you that are watching, right? You cannot introduce another chemical to deal with the chemicals. Like, I get that mentality, I really do. In the beginning of my sobriety, I would have been right alongside you. But what happened was people died. They died trying to, in their minds, potentially reach an unattainable goal, right? At that time in their lives. Not unattainable forever, at the time, okay? So what I'm introducing weed because it's very relevant, it's legal now, right? So there's all kinds of people probably experimenting, good, right? The idea is to minimize harm, okay? Now if I'd have come in, cleaned up from booze and morphine and immediately started smoking weed, I would have been an outcast where I went, right? I would have been an outcast. How do I know that? Because I watched other people become outcasts because of these things. Whether it was, now I'm using weed because that's going to be a controversial hot button for people. But here's another one, okay? Antipsychotics, okay? Antipsychotics or antidepressants, okay? Now, antipsychotics are more for other illnesses than depression. You get those for schizophrenia, bipolar, and all kinds of different illnesses, right? That use antipsychotics, because sometimes depression does too, right? Depends on the level of what's going on inside the brain, right? So I'm not a doctor, I'm not even going to try to unpack that. What I am getting at though, is if back when I came in, people talked about this stuff like it was a bad thing. They talked about it like it was the same thing as any other drug, like cocaine for that. And honestly, I've heard people make the direct connection. So, not me, but I've heard it. So, these are no different than this, right? That's the essence of it. Or plant-based. I'll just say plant-based medicine. Because as time goes on, people are studying psychotropics, right? Like LSD, MDM, or DMT, MDMA, mushrooms, all those different things, because they're finding a correlation between getting better and utilizing those other plant-based medicines. So what I do is I look at all of this the same. Okay? I look at this the same now, right? The reason I do, again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to harp on this, is because I've lost friends and really cool fucking people to overdoses who may have otherwise been able to somehow maintain or reduce the harm utilizing other medications or other medicines. Okay? I'm not saying again that causes it. It's not what I'm saying. But we all know, those of us who are in recovery, that a big percentage of why we use, yes, we have developed a brain illness. Absolutely. I say develop because not everybody's born with it. Some people get it through practice, right? So there's scientific evidence that obviously if you use a chemical long enough, you can become dependent and thereby addicted, and then gradually addicted, right? So all the information that we've been given, that you're all born with it, yes, some of us are. I believe I was born with it, but I'm not, I don't know. I'm just telling you what I believe. It's very possible that I wasn't born with it, but what activated it was my excessive drinking when I was a teenager, right? That had the potential to activate whatever the hell's going on inside my head, right? With my overconsumption. Okay, so there's all kinds of benefits from medicine. Okay, so for the first 10 years, I refused to take my antidepressants. Well, let me rephrase that. I refused to be diagnosed. Every time my doctor talked about diagnosis, I was out. I said, I don't think I need that. But you know why? I can only speak for myself. When I came in, I heard all of this talk, all the anti-medication. There are people in some of the 12-step groups that actually think if you have schizophrenia, you shouldn't take your medicine. Okay? So I'm going to say, please take your medicine. If a doctor has prescribed it, please take it. If you found some other medicine that helps keep you from blowing up your life, maybe try taking that. If it's not hurting you, maybe try to find a harm reduction level. Okay? To where, if you're able to do that. Now, I would find that very difficult for myself, right? In terms of just doing it on my own. However, it's not difficult if you actually are honest about it. If you find people that you can confide in that aren't going to judge you, even if they don't take medicine, right? But that aren't going to judge you, then we can absolutely make some progress here with harm reduction. Now, I'm not going to get into the safe consumption sites. And the reason I'm not going to is because, first of all, everybody has an opinion on it. I think they save lives if they're done correctly. I don't think the Alberta models have been done correctly. I believe that the Vancouver model is done correctly, and a lot of the other big cities down in the States have a good idea. Or maybe not the States, but other parts of the world. Because the US is still stuck on abstinence as well. Because nothing fits the war on drugs like abstinence, right? You can't perpetuate something if you say, well, it's not as harmful to everybody, but the reality is that's what drugs are. Some are more harmful to some people and less harmful to others. More addictive, less addictive, right? I've never had an inclination to do cocaine or crack or meth. Not yet, but up until now I have not had that urge. Why is that? Supposedly those are the best, right? Well, my brain likes something else. So obviously, there isn't a one-size drug that fits everybody, so there's not a one-size recovery. So now we're going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, okay? You've probably heard it battered around quite a bit. It's really not that complicated to kind of get in the flow of it once you understand what you're trying to do, right? So what we're really trying to do with CBT is we're trying to look at, so I'm going to summarize, I'm not copying it straight from anything. So basically, you're cognitive, so you're thinking, okay? We understand that thoughts equal sometimes feelings. Well, I should say sometimes, but they always do. Thinking equals feelings equals behavior. So the idea is we address the thoughts that are causing the feelings and the behavior, essentially, okay? And the behavior, we can absolutely, there is evidence that changing behavior can result in thoughts changing, in thoughts and feelings changing. Okay? These things can work together. It's not necessarily going to be one before the other. And we're going to talk about behavior modification as we go through this. I'll try to separate the behavior mod from the CBT. But really, if you think about it, behavior mod is just addressing the behavior itself. The behavior modification isn't interested in what we're thinking or feeling. Okay? Behavior modification is simply looking at the consequences of the action. Okay? And now for some of us, this might be very difficult in the beginning, okay? Because we don't necessarily fully grasp the level of what's happened emotionally and in our intellect, okay? So in the beginning, changing behaviors might absolutely be the best you could do, right? And really, when I came into recovery, I was 100% in behavior modification mode, okay? Based on who I was when I came in, the information I had at my disposal in terms of my professional life, okay? I was able to, right away, the behavior I needed to change before my thoughts changed was drinking and using morphine. No matter what, I needed to change that behavior, okay? So whether it was going to be, I had no idea about this at the time, whether it was going to be reduce the amounts I drank and used, or but I'd already done that. So that's the kicker, right? Is that when I came into a 12-step group, I'd already tried behavior modification. I tried CBT. Before it was coined a phrase, we were trying to do those things, right? The idea is that sometimes when we get that addiction, that we can't change that behavior, right? So what we got to do is we got to change our thinking around it, right? So really we want to address our thinking. Usually what happens, and therapy just means having activities, okay, to do this, or activities or some kind of formula that you're going to use, okay, for this. So we're going to try to teach ourselves how to rethink about things that bother us, that maybe cause us to want to avoid. We need to address that, okay? So that's really, if you think about it, that's what the 12 steps are doing, okay? If you take the religious connotations out of it, the 12 steps are basically the cognition, okay? That's changing the cognition. So for me though, what I had to do, this is when I came in, was I had to stop picking up before I could go back here, okay? Because I wasn't willing to. So you can imagine, I wasn't willing to or able, however you want to describe it. I say willing because today's mind, I look back and say I probably had the potential, right? I just chose not to. So, but I don't know. We can't go back, right? There's no need to prolong the past or invite the future, right? We just want to be here. And I'll quote Baba Ram Das for that, okay? We don't want to prolong the past or invite the future. We want to be here and present. It's very essential for CBT, is being present, okay? Because you want to be able to understand your thoughts. Understand thinking and how those thoughts impact you. Okay? Thoughts impact. And obviously impact on emotional and physical health, right? Spiritual as well. Because we can be real stinkers up here to ourselves. That's right, I said stinker. Because I get to see my niece tomorrow and I just saw my nephew who's a stinker. So we're going to do that, okay? Once we understand our thinking and how those thoughts impact our physical and emotional and spiritual well-beings, then we can start looking at it. So what we're thinking about in terms of here is what causes it, okay? What happened to cause my thinking to spiral? Why am I thinking about this thing this way? Are there different ways? So let's use abstinence as an example. Okay? So abstinence. For some people, it probably creates a great deal of stress to even think about abstinence. Okay? But what about abstinence causes that stress? Is it because I think about abstinence but I can't be abstinent? Is that causing me the stress? Maybe, but maybe it's other things. Right? You may have someone from your past who preached abstinence over and over and over again. like beat the dead horse on it, right? And all they were assholes about it. They didn't give you compassion. They didn't explain the whole thing. They just talked about this, and if you don't do this, you're morally weak or corrupt, right? Now, even though the 12-step groups talk about togetherness, and it is 100%, you got to be together, right, to make it. Also, some of that stuff can get in the way of really just doing what we need to do, which is understand why we're thinking the way we're thinking. Why are those thoughts causing me to feel this way? What about that? That's really what CBT is all about. We're examining these things more closely. And as we examine them, we are looking for alternate meanings. Okay? So, as an example, if someone says certain words about church, for example, I get my back straight up. Okay? It goes straight up. Now, in like a CBT evaluation, I'm going to look at why. When I'm thinking about that, why does my back go up? Why do I get defensive? Then I start thinking, is there a present danger or is this a past thing? What am I bringing into this thought now that is causing an emotional reaction, which I can't control the emotions. Once it's happening, then all I can do are some pretty simple things to slow down, right? But we'll talk about that in a minute. So I want alternate meanings for what I'm thinking. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but if I have a story in my head that I've told myself for 45 years, you can bet that's the answer I'm going to give myself when I look, right? Unless I look outside of self. So I need to look outside of self for answers. So much like going back to harm reduction and saying, well, this worked for me, therefore it must work for everyone, right? This is the opposite of that. This is, well, this worked for me, but what works for others? How do other people cope with this thought, with these thoughts? How do other people address the feelings, right? Are there more ways to look at this than just mine? Really, in my mind, this is a perception checker. Okay? It's a perception checker. It's a fancy way of looking at what's going on in my head leading me to behaviors, right? And most of the time the behaviors are going to be destructive behaviors because I'm not really looking to address my positive behaviors, right? Like I'm looking to address my negative ones. So, and we can use examples all day long, okay? The idea is we want to get out of our own head and we want to check our perception. Sometimes we're going to be alone when we're doing this. So in order to check our perception when we're alone, how do we do that? We have to be better self-evaluators, right? And oftentimes, self-evaluation needs help, okay? Our self-evaluation will always need some help. Why is that? Because when I wake up in the morning, I automatically think I'm a piece of shit, right? So if I give you that and I say, well, I need some help with my self-evaluation. What makes me a piece of shit, right? Gradually examining why I call myself a piece of shit every time I looked in the mirror, right? Eventually I started to figure out that no, I was still feeling like a piece of shit from some of the stuff that I had done when I was young, right? That those feelings stuck with me. They stuck with me because I held on to them and I was trying to prolong the past. I've been saturated with Ram Dass for like 3 days. So my brain is a little squishy and all about love, right? So this is probably a good time for this video. Okay, so we need some help with that. We need perception checkers, right? So I'm going to suggest we work with someone, okay, on this stuff, especially if we've never done it before. Look, if you've been doing it for a long time and you're really good, you understand yourself enough that you're not getting into like trouble everywhere you go, chances are you might not need to work with someone as regularly. The reason I say work with someone, it's always perception checking, okay? It's really why people come to see me. They want to check their perception of what's going on in their life and find out if they're literally stuck in a pattern or if this really is the only solution, right? Oftentimes, that's what counseling is. You just bring it in and we do some perception checking. We figure out what needs are, okay? What are needs? Okay? So there's like lots of harm reduction models in the States now, or in Canada as well, and all of them bring to light the idea that we need to perception check. We need to check on what's working, what's not working, even if it's that simple, right? So in order to gradually maybe stop a behavior, we employ CBT, or even immediately. It might work on some things right away, right? But also, behavior modification is the other part of that, okay? So behavior modification is going to be, we're addressing the behavior because if you continue the behavior, you're either going to A, die, okay? Or B, be in jail, or C, some other loss of family, loss of employment, all kinds of loss will come, right, potentially come, if we don't stop certain behaviors, right? So a behavior modification technique that I had to use in the beginning was, okay, I used to like to steal a lot. Like, I wouldn't even tell you it was because I was greedy. It was just because I liked to do it. Like, literally, no good fucking reason, right? Except that my illness had twisted this sense of entitlement, right? For things, right? It was just so strange because it was always stupid shit too. Like, I can't tell you, well, it wasn't always stupid shit. When I was younger, we stole drugs and alcohol and shit, so, which was fun. Back when you're younger. But when you're 30 doing it, it's not fun anymore. So behavior mod, okay? Once we have like a pretty good evaluation of ourselves, maybe we're working with someone, mirroring, doing stuff like that, it's all very helpful, right? If we don't take ourselves too seriously, it can be really, really helpful, okay? So behavior mod. We are looking at measurable, identifiable, easily identifiable outcomes, okay? That's what behavior modification, why did I say moderation? Because we're actually talking about moderation, modification, in terms of harm reduction, I guess. So my brain is wandering down that pathway. So behavior modification, we want it to be, it's going to be measurable, identifiable outcomes. You're going to be able to see, look, I stopped stealing, therefore my risk of going to jail from stealing, yeah, right? That was one I had to do right away. I'll tell you an example of one I couldn't do right away, which was sex. For some reason, the harder I gripped trying to control not having sex with people, the worse it got. Why? Probably because this was not in place. My ideas about sex and relationships were so convoluted with illness and toxicity that I had no fucking idea where I was coming from. If you asked me, I could probably give you an intellectual answer at the time, but it wouldn't have been true. It would have been me making something up to try to make myself look better and feel better, right? The reality is I had none of this. The self-evaluation that I thought I had, this, oh, I know myself so well, right? It was, yeah, I did. I knew the lie so well. I knew the lie that I had been living so well because all of the information to build that lie came from me, right? So I was snowed under it, man. And it happens to lots of us. We come in, we just think we know who we are, we think we know what's supposed to be happening, and the reality is we fucking don't, right? Because when I came in, I had no idea who I was supposed to be. All I had in my mind was this piece of shit, right? That's all it was just accumulation of shit, okay? So that self-evaluation was impossible right away for me. It's not impossible for everybody. For me it was, otherwise it would have happened, right? So I tried, I choked it, like, trying to control myself in terms of acting out sexually, whether it was with women or men, whether it was relationships or just casual sex. Things spiraled for my first couple years of sobriety because I was using sex really to harm reduce. So obviously using people to reduce harm is not a good idea, right? Because eventually people tell you to go fuck yourself, and rightfully so. So, and you can tell it's happened once or twice. And I'm actually glad they did, right? Because it was like the truth finally came out, right? So anyway, behavior mod with sex was impossible, right? I don't know why it was, I just couldn't get it, man. I just didn't understand enough of why I was doing it, what was driving it. And I certainly wasn't willing at that time to look at it like, even though there was part of my cognition that was recognizing sex was helping me in some other ways, because it was. I'm sorry to say it was. It's pleasurable. There's pleasurable outcomes, even that matched up with the consequences that were negative, right? It was still usable in my mind at the time. So I couldn't stop it. But some things I was able to kind of control. I was not violent. I was not violent as often. And gradually, anger started to lessen. Doesn't mean I can't still have a temper tantrum every now and again, right? Like it happens. I'm still just a big child. But these things started to become smaller, right? As I was gripping sex, right, trying to control it, these other things started to like subside. So there was a purpose for it, even though it may not have been the answer that I wanted. What I wanted was to stop pursuing and spending all my time thinking and talking about and trying to achieve sex. Basically trying to get off, right? If I minimize it, if I say it like that, then my brain says, yeah, you were just trying to get off. It was just like trying to go out and score some, I don't know, some Valium or something like that, right? Like same idea. So obviously that was tricky. So in order to deal with sex, what I had to do was come back up to CBT, deal with the cognition, deal with the triggers, the rewards, all the different things that I had to evaluate in order to understand what was happening to me when I would do these things, right? And so that's what self-evaluation is when you're able to look at what you're actually doing for what it is, right? Without the justification, without the rationalization, without the fantasizing, without the romanticizing, whatever it is you want to call it, a real self-evaluation doesn't include those things. It simply includes, as we talked about on the video with the 12 steps, if you want to refer to step 4 and 5, because that's what step 4 is doing. It's a proper self-evaluation if done honestly. Just honestly. I can't say correctly because there's not just one way to do it. But if it's done honestly, you will absolutely gain some of this self-evaluation. And it will absolutely be legitimate, right? You will come out of this process being able to see potentially why this behavior is so important, right? Why in my brain I thought I might die if I stopped doing this, right? Now, a part of me was 100% accurate. If I'd have stopped doing that, I say possibly. If I'd have stopped doing this, who knows how long it would have taken me to drink? Who knows how long it would have taken me to pick up some more morphine? Who knows, right? We can't know that, but there is correlation, right? I can see correlation because of how life has changed, okay? Life has changed dramatically from these things. This is not even something that is of interest to me very often. Unfortunately for Heather, right? It's like I've reached old age at 45. I think it's like the old age for addicts is 45 years old. I don't know. My body feels 70. My libido feels 90. So anyway, I got those out of my system maybe when I was younger. But the reality is, behavior modification can work, okay? But it doesn't always work. CBT can work, okay? But it's not always going to work. So what we want to do is what we're trying to do with these videos is expand our tool belt, right? So we talk about it a lot in recovery. What's in the tool belt? What's in there? What are the things that we're going to do that are important? So basically, what I'm going to talk about now are strategies to get us into a position where we can evaluate our cognition a little bit better than if we're in a pattern. Behavior modification, how do we get there, right? Like, how do we get to a place where we can actually pause? So everything that I teach or that I've experienced comes way better with a pause, okay? So the pause can be done obviously in many different ways. How I do the pause is not necessarily how it's going to work for you, but maybe a variation might, right? So my pause includes stop what I'm doing, breathe for the count of 10, at least 10, okay? Now the reason I do at least 10 is because I have found that 10 is the number for my brain. That if I can stop and breathe some deep breaths, nice slow deep breaths for 10, I perform better. That's exactly what works for me, 10. Sometimes though, I do 10 4 times, right? Because if I'm really excited or I'm really agitated, then my breaths, even when I try to slow down, are still too fast. So I will simply go through this pause as many times as I need to before I open my mouth. Now this is theoretically the idea, okay? Theoretically, and I've experienced both, obviously. I've experienced doing this and not talking until I'm 100% in that calm place. And by calm, I just simply mean absent of all the things that I was attached to in the beginning, right? When it caused my reaction. So once I get a reaction, so we'll say reaction up here, okay? Maybe my reaction is anger, we'll call it anger, okay? And there's a person telling me something that I don't want to believe, or that contradicts something I previously have believed. We're just going to call it that, because this is really sometimes what gets my brain all messed up, right? Is having a conversation with someone when I perhaps have behaved in a way that I did not want to behave in. Maybe I caused somebody some harm. The person, and by harm in this respect, I don't mean punch them in the neck. I mean, like, I may have said something that was insensitive. Let's just try that. Because honestly, I don't go around beating people up. So we're going to just call it that, okay? I say something, the rebuttal is, it causes this, blah, blah, blah. My first instinct, defense. Okay? That's my first instinct. So from that position of defense, all I'm doing if I don't pause, I found this about myself, all I'm doing if I don't pause is I'm reacting. I'm reacting and I'm ignorant. Usually it's ignorance that causes me that reaction. And how I know that is when I do stop, after I realize I may have crossed the line. And I full stop, full pause, do the breathing. If I need to meditate, I will remove myself and meditate. Pray, if you pray. So, right off the top, 2 things that meditation and prayer bring to you is a pause. No matter what's going on, you got to stop, you got to pray, you got to meditate, it's a pause. That's what we're trying to develop, okay, with our practice, no matter what our practice is. But if we really want to modify our behavior, we have to, in some cases, obviously some will be easier than others, look, I stop shooting people, people stop dying, I stop going to jail. Okay? That's like the extreme end. But we're talking about behaviors that we don't automatically think are wrong, right? That's why it's tough. That's why when it came to sex in me, what I had to do was retool my insides before the outside circumstances would change. So that's CBT. I didn't even know I was doing it, but that's what I was doing. And then behavior mod came with when I was able to not respond out of anger, right? I was breathing a little bit, maybe pausing, and I was able to no longer have to act out of anger, right? I no longer had to respond to somebody pushing me by running them over with my car, right? That's how my brain used to work. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. If you pushed me, I was running you over with my car, right? If you hit me, I was going to shoot you. That's how my brain was. It was that reaction. It always has to be one up, right? In order to survive, right? I get it now. That's where it was going, trying to keep me alive, even though there was no danger, right? But that reaction doesn't know the difference. It takes the danger of 100 years ago and makes it relevant today, right? When I'm not aware. And we talked about that. So one of the things that meditation and prayer give you, regardless of how you do it, okay, is pause. It gives you the initial pause to get out of that mindset, right? That's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get out of the reactionary mindset. So whether it be going and drinking or going and picking up dope, whatever it is, we want to pause. So how else might we do this? I'm going to include someone else, because I find working with another person to be 100% more helpful than doing this by myself. And the reason is because I'm no different than anyone else. My brain lies to me. My brain still tries to tell me certain things aren't the way it was. but it is, right? But why would it do that? It wants to change that story so that I'm not embarrassed, right? About my past or all that kind of stuff. It's funny because the very act of keeping that out leads to being more embarrassed and more ashamed, right? But the brain's not thinking that way. Or the ego, however you want to put it, is not thinking that way. So we pause. We need this pause. Some people can then, I don't know, maybe they write, maybe they walk, maybe they sing, maybe they play an instrument. Okay? The pause is to get us to refocus on something else. So even if we're pausing and say we go for a walk, we're going for a walk, our pause told us that we needed to go for a walk, get some separation, get some distance, right? Awesome. The mere act of walking might take us out of the mindset of reactionary. Okay? Now, is it always going to work that way? No, not if you don't like walking. Right? If you don't like walking, it's not going to work. But maybe you like writing. Okay? Absolutely. Pause. Evaluate. Evaluative writing. Okay? Write down what's going on in your thoughts. Write down how those thoughts are impacting your feelings. And then write down how it's impacting your behavior. Right? Challenge them. I'm going to say this. Challenge your beliefs if they don't serve. They don't serve you. But also, challenge them if they do. Okay? Challenge if they do serve. Because some of the ones that work for us are still tied to our illness. Right? So I know that we talked about a lot of stuff in this video. Now I'm going to encourage you to look into behavior modification if there's some behaviors you're trying to stop, but also look into CBT because maybe there needs to be a combination, right? For my money, if you ask me what the best way is, I'm going to say all the ways, right? That's going to be the best way. If you say, Dave, what's the best philosophy to get better or to recover or whatever it is, all the ways. Take in every bit of positive stuff you can to incorporate, or positive or healthy, however you want to word it. But take in as much of that as you can. And then try to understand it in a tangible way, right? Practicing it in your life, right? So now I know this pause, this is very simplistic, okay? But I want to tell you how much you're going to need the simple when you're reacting, okay? You're going to need the simple. You're going to need the count to 10, okay? You're going to need the meditation or the prayer or some variation of those things to pause. The idea is to pause the thinking and get out of that thought process, right? Because there's always other thought processes that are possible, probable, maybe even more helpful, right? But if we get stuck in our own head, that's where we're going to stay, okay? So thank you for your time. Thanks for watching these videos. And yeah, take good care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Take care.
Videotape this for a while.
Yeah, you just want a video. You shake it off. Okay.